recognize that, that everybody's talking about the election, so I'm going to work some of that into this conversation that I'd like to have with you this morning. I just returned from Ireland a few days ago, and before that I was in the Netherlands, and if this is anything like being there are going to be a lot of conversations about the President-elect Donald Trump and what we might expect in terms of economic and other sorts of policies. So let me jump right in because I don't have all that much time. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of a recognition of what it is that President Trump is facing when he is sworn in January, what kind of economy he's going to inherit in the United States, and what sort of global forces are at work and may prove to be something that he's got to deal with as President of the United States. So we recognize that the IMF has been revising downward global growth for a long period of time. Each time they make a projection, a year or so goes by and they say, well, our new projection is somewhat more grim than the past one, and then grimmer still and grimmer still, to the point that we're now looking at global GDP growth estimates of something on the order of 3.5% on average, which of course means that while some countries will do better than that, a number of countries are doing worse than that, are expected to do worse than that. So terms like secular stagnation that Larry Summers has revived have very much taken hold in the United States. These are the sort of things that economists there are preoccupied with. How are we going to deal with, in terms of macroeconomic policy, a world in which inflation remains terribly low and real GDP growth remains quite anemic? So this term sloth has been invented by someone to describe the sort of world that we face. Not just the United States, obviously, but other countries slowing as well. When we listen to the Federal Reserve, and they give in speeches and so forth their own estimation of how the labor market is looking, how the real economy is looking, what do we hear them saying? Are they optimistic? Do they feel like the US has fully recovered and that now is the time to begin so-called normalizing, raising interest rates? Well, it depends who you're listening to, right? Because different members of the Federal Open Market Committee, the body that sets interest rates in the United States, really do see the economy differently. There are at least a few members of the Open Market Committee who would like to have started raising rates quite some time ago. And the majority, however, have preferred to lay off of raising interest rates, to be patient. Now, Janet Yellen has said recently that the case for rate hikes has increased. What she sees is a strengthening economy, and she's beginning to lay the foundation so that markets are fully prepared for the increases that are set to come. Recognizing that it's been difficult for the Fed, because with oil prices as they were near $40 a barrel, this made some industries in the US suffer a great deal, specifically the energy sector. We were and still are in some places doing quite a lot of fracking, hydraulic fracking, oil, natural gas exploration. And with oil prices very low, that began to bind in some of these industries, and it was no longer profitable. And that forced them to cut back investment in those areas, and that pushed GDP growth down. So while we're still seeing growth of about 180,000 jobs, private sector payroll jobs on average per month, it's not really impressive. Inflation remains below the Fed's 2% target, and it has been below the Fed's 2% target essentially since the recovery took hold. The Fed does tell us that eventually they're going to hit the 2% target. Just give them another 2 to 3 years, and we will be looking at an economy with an unemployment rate somewhere around 4.5% and an inflation rate of about 2%, right where the Fed wants it. If that all plays out, and nothing happens in the intervening period, no negative shock of any kind, then the expectation is that the Fed will begin hiking interest rates, perhaps as soon as next month. So our central bank, the Federal Reserve, has a dual mandate. It is charged with responsibility for delivering both high levels of economic growth, high levels of employment, and stable inflation, 2%. So if you can achieve those two things, high growth, low unemployment, stable inflation, why do we get Donald Trump if that's what the US economy looks like? Why did so many people, particularly white working class individuals, come out to vote against Hillary Clinton, the establishment candidate, and for Donald Trump, the change candidate, if the US economy is in fact doing so well? So that's one question. Larry Summers has an answer. Here, a partial answer. Larry recognizes that in fact, on the surface, things might look rather good, but beneath the surface, if you look more closely, you find that the benefits, the gains that have been made on paper, what appears to be economic success story, is actually much less impressive. So what Larry says is, essentially, all of the improvement in the US economy since the Great Recession is due not to the fact that we've improved in real terms, that the economy is growing and doing better, but that we've reduced our own definition of what is possible, of our potential economic GDP. So here's what happened. This is the blue line is 2007. This is before the crisis. And that trajectory is what the establishment thought, CBO, Fed, all of the government agencies that make long-term forecasts. This is what the consensus opinion was for the US economy going forward. We should be growing along that trajectory, real GDP. And the red line is where we actually were. That's our actual GDP. So the blue line is our potential. The red line is actual. When they touch, you're at full employment. You're producing as much as it's possible to produce. And then the crisis happens, and the red line diverges, and real GDP begins to fall. And the establishment revises downward their expectation of what our own country's potential is. And as the economy continues to turn down, right, we're in recession, the revisions continue. The economy begins to improve, and yet we continue to revise downward our own potential GDP. And what Larry points out is that instead of raising growth back up to potential, what we did was lower potential, and that closed some of the GDP gap. But the remaining gap was there, not because we improved the overall economy, but because we redefined what it is that we consider possible to produce in the US. So Larry says, in other words, through the recovery, we have made no progress in restoring GDP to its potential. You know Larry Summers, right? The former Secretary of the US Treasury. It's a big name, influential voice in the US. And to make this observation, that in fact we did not get anything by way of an improvement in the US economy over that entire period of time, but just redefined the terms, is rather striking. And I think it explains something about why people felt like the US economy was not working well and why they were willing to go out and make a vote for Donald Trump. And so even though the picture says we're almost back to full employment, the reality is probably quite different. The good news, Janet Yellen says, is that we still have a little bit of room left to run. That is, the Fed is willing to be patient, has been willing to be patient, not raise interest rates, because the belief was that there was still enough slack in the labor market that the Fed could hold off, not try to slow things down, be patient, and allow the economy to grow and create more jobs. for a period of time. What's the bad news? The bad news is that eventually something's going to happen and the recovery will be taken off the tracks. Eventually. I don't know when, and I don't know what the trigger will be, but I can guarantee you that the US will move back into recession at some point. It's never a question of whether we will have another recession. It is always a question of, it's never a question of whether we will have a recession. We always will have another recession. It's not a question of if it will happen. Okay? Market economies, all market economies, experience business cycles. And every boom will be followed by a period of bust. And every bust will precede the next boom. And that's the way market economies operate. Capitalism is dynamic. Capitalism runs on sales. In the US, real GDP in the last quarter 3 of this year, came in at 2.9%. That was pretty good. But overall, the Fed is expecting less than 2% growth this year, 1.8, and 2% for the next couple of years. So this is not impressive by any stretch of the imagination. When the next recession comes, the headwinds will have overtaken the tailwinds, and that will bring about the next recession. The question is, what will the Fed do in response? The Fed has conventional tools. Everybody's heard about central banks and their toolkits, right? What are the conventional tools? In the old days, central banks did one thing, really. They changed the interest rate. That was the policy tool. But because the last crisis was so long, so persistent, so deep, the Fed exhausted that tool. Interest rates were pushed to 0 across much of the world. And then they had to get creative because the conventional tool wasn't enough. So they did things like open up an unconventional toolkit. So we saw things like quantitative easing, both here and around the world. The Bank of Japan, of course, has been doing this for a number of years, indeed decades. The ECB, the Bank of England, the US, all the central banks of the world began embarking on these programs of quantitative easing, buying financial assets, trying, hoping that this would somehow stimulate lending and spending and shorten the duration of the downturn and bring about a recovery. Forward guidance, increased reliance on language, speaking, communication, the idea that central banks need to be effective communicators, that you need transparency, that you must be perceived as credible. Policies must be perceived as credible so that markets will take action on the basis of the Fed's essentially instructions about how to form expectations about future interest rate moves and inflation and so forth. Zero interest rate policy, we already talked about. So these are some of the unconventional things that were done. And the question is, this is where we are in the US today. This chart is really an interesting one, I think. It goes back to 1957. So these are all of the post-World War II recessions in the United States. And what you see is, this is where the interest rate was when the recession started. And this is how much the central bank had to cut rates during this recession. And so they cut rates to here. And then during the recovery, they raised rates to here. And then we had another recession, and rates were cut to here. And then during the recovery, they raised rates to up there, and then cut to here during the recession, and then raised rates. And you can see that each time, rates went higher than their previous high. But that all changed somewhere after the Volcker period. Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the Fed in the late 70s and early into 1980. And so then the Fed starts lowering interest rates, but each time it raises rates in the recovery, they never get interest rates back up as high as they had been in the previous rate tightening, or loosening, however you want to look at it. And so here we are today. Now, if history repeats itself, we're only going to get up to about here before we have to go down again. And the problem the Fed sees is that it doesn't have the room to cut rates substantially enough to help bring about a recovery. The traditional tool probably isn't going to cut it in the next recession. What does that mean? Janet Yellen has told us recently. It means we're going to go unconventional again. It means we're going to have to do more bond buying. Maybe we'll even buy other things, like the Bank of Japan is doing, or the ECB. Maybe we'll buy corporate bonds or equities or real estate or student loan debt. I don't know. But she says we may have to consider a broader range of assets the next time we do this. Some more experience with forward guidance. I mean, she's actually started already to describe the kind of things the Fed might do next time. Negative interest rates. So far, the Federal Reserve has said it will not follow the Bank of Japan, the ECB, and other central banks down this path. And that, I think, is the good news. Negative interest rates don't make a whole lot of sense to me. Bonds are supposed to provide safe fixed income, not fixed losses. And I think central banks that are experiencing with negative interest rates are beginning to see some unanticipated negative consequences of that. So this is the monetary paddle. This is what we have the next time we go into recession. Maybe we'll target inflation expectations. That's what the Bank of Japan has been trying to do. So you try to talk up people's expectations of future inflation, effectively trying to scare them into spending today. So you say prices are going to be higher in the future. And they say, oh my God, I better buy a TV today. But what's happened in Japan, in many cases, is that people are reporting that they're not going out and increasing spending today because they fear higher inflation in the future. What they're doing is saving more today, that is spending less, because they're trying to hit nominal savings targets for retirement. They're actually increasing saving and reducing spending. So it's having exactly the opposite effect as to what is desired. Jackson Hole is a town in Wyoming where the Federal Reserve organizes a conference each year, gets together with academics and other Fed officials and talks about, what are the main concerns about the economy going forward and how policymakers should respond. They just had their meeting in Jackson Hole a couple of months ago, and what we heard coming out of there were some mixed messages about the capacity of monetary policy to respond, and others saying, if it happens, if we get a recession, we're fine, we'll do what we did last time, no big deal, okay? I think we have to look beyond the central bank, not just in the US, but everywhere. We've given too much responsibility to central banks to steer and guide macroeconomic performance, and they have limited tools and limited capacity to achieve the objectives that have been assigned to them. We need the other paddle. And for too long, we ignored the other paddle. And only now are we beginning to see and hear a chorus of voices from the IMF and the OECD and BIS and academics beginning to talk about the F word. Okay, I'm going to use the F word now. Fiscal policy. Okay, fiscal policy. For too long, we were reluctant to talk about fiscal policy. Here is then Chairman Ben Bernanke testifying before Congress, a testy Congress, because the economy wasn't improving. It wasn't improving significantly enough. And members of Congress were holding his feet to the fire. Man, what is going on? You guys are throwing money out the helicopter, all this stuff, helicopter Ben. You're doing all this stuff, and I don't see the benefits to the real economy. Why isn't this working? I want you to listen to what Bernanke says.
Let me just agree with you and follow me that monetary policy is not a panacea. It is not the ideal tool.
Okay, I don't know whether you could hear him, but I'll repeat it. Monetary policy is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. It's not even the ideal tool. Now, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve tells you under oath that monetary policy is not the ideal tool, what do you suppose he is hinting at without actually saying it? He's trying to say, you, Mr. Congressman, and your colleagues, you ought to be doing something because you're the ones who can really fix the problem, not the Fed. We're not a panacea. We're not even the ideal tool. Think about it in the context of we've given them a dual mandate and told them they're in charge of the economy. And here he is saying, it's not the ideal tool. Okay, so we've got to start talking about fiscal policy more. There are people at the Fed who will talk about it, like the president of the San Francisco Fed, John Williams, who's an influential voice. He says, if we could come up with better fiscal policy, it would take the pressure off of us at the Fed to come up with other ways to accomplish goals, like expanding the Fed's balance sheet and so forth, right? We wouldn't have to do all this stuff. That, many economists believe, has exacerbated income and wealth inequality, potentially fueled asset price inflation and indeed bubbles and so forth. So the negative effects of QE, he's saying we could avoid all of that stuff if we could just get better fiscal policy. But here's the problem in the US. This is a little bit of a longer video. It runs a couple of minutes, but it's important. I want you to see from our perspective in the United States politically just how difficult it is to get anything done on the fiscal policy side, that is tax and spending policy. Okay, so let me play this.
Driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We've got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is I think
I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and tax.
I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I know what taxes were. Does that mean you want the middle class? Okay, does that mean you know why? Because it wasn't $400 million more on the budget. It just came along.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue,
for decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real. They are really in trouble, and it's something
Our need for comprehensive deficit reduction. The answer is no, yes, no, yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. It's not sustainable.
You cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up. And we're spending money we do not have a debt burden.
Oh, that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. You can't steal from the kids and grandkids.
We think that deficit and national debt are a moral welfare.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
That's depressing, right? That is president, past and current presidential candidates, and the most influential voices on network and cable television in the US, all saying exactly the same thing. There's bipartisan agreement on this issue. People say, oh, well, nobody in Washington can agree on anything. Baloney. They all agree on this, right? That debt and deficits are a problem. We have to eliminate them and work to be fiscally responsible and all that sort of stuff. Well, if you think you need fiscal policy as an effective paddle to offset and counter the weakness in the macroeconomy, how the heck are you supposed to get fiscal policy through if this is what you're up against? This is the challenge for us in the United States. And the problem, of course, is that you hear what they go out and say, and they talk to voters, and they say it's irresponsible, we're burdening the next generation, it's immoral, the Chinese won't let us go on like this forever, thing after thing. And people hear this, and it makes sense. We're going to go broke, we're going to bankrupt the nation and all that stuff. And they say, I can't run my household finances like that. I understand my household finances. I know that I can't spend more than I take in year after year after year, piling up debt. I know that people go broke, they go bankrupt. I've seen it happen to people I know, companies go broke. So it makes perfect sense that governments can go broke as well, and that the federal government is doing something irresponsible. It should pay down debt, and it should save, not spend more than it takes in. We all know this. And of course, this is great advice at the individual level. It's perfectly reasonable for people in the finance community, who are my primary audiences, to tell their clients, don't spend everything you make. Save something, set it aside, pay down your debt, right? Perfectly reasonable, but as Paul McCulley, who was chief economist at PIMCO for a number of years, says, it makes sense at the individual level, but if everybody in the economy tries to do it at the same time, it kills income, kills growth. It's catastrophic. How can it be that something that's good for the individual is bad if all individuals practice it together? If everyone in the economy tries to follow this very sage advice, what could possibly be wrong with that? And what's wrong with it is something that Keynes taught us almost 100 years ago when he talked about the paradox of thrift. And that's what McCulley was referring to in his remarks. What's wrong with it is that capitalist economies run on sales. Capitalism runs on sales. Capitalism is about producing and selling things for a profit, right? And that's how you remain in business. You can't produce and sell your stuff and turn a profit. You don't stay around very long. You have to have customers, and those customers have to have income to spend. Spending turns the wheel. Capitalism runs on sales. One person's spending is another person's income, and income creates sales, and sales create jobs. And interruption in that process at any point threatens to create a lack of demand for the things that are produced, and ultimately cause production to contract and workers to be laid off because they aren't needed. My concern is that what we have done, not just in the US, but across the globe, austerity was a real thing for a lot of countries for a really long time, and for many countries it still is a real thing. We have vilified spending in an economy that runs on sales. You cannot make spending the enemy. If the goal is higher GDP, how can it possibly make sense to say we're going to cut spending to grow the economy? After all, what is GDP? But a measure of total spending. That's what GDP is. It's how much we spend on goods and services in a given period of time. You can't grow the economy by cutting spending. It's an oxymoron. If we're going to keep the recovery going, not just in the US, but countries around the world who are in the recovery phase of the business cycle, if you're going to keep a recovery going, you need what? You need spending to remain at a high enough level to ensure that there are enough customers to buy enough output to make the firms profitable so that they continue to produce and maybe even invest and produce more and hire more so that the recovery phase, the expansion phase, continues. Where does that demand come from? It can only come from three places. It has to come either from the domestic private sector, from the domestic public sector, or from the rest of the world. It can't come from anywhere else. The point is there has to be enough demand in the aggregate to keep spending at a level that sustains the recovery. Things that are a bad sign for growth are things like this. This is what basically we have in the US, are two political parties, both of whom usually push us in the wrong direction. Democrats run around all the time saying, okay, we have a deficit, this is not good, we need to raise revenue, by which they mean we have to raise taxes, because that'll help us shrink the deficit. But every dollar you tax away from someone is a dollar they don't have and can't spend buying new goods and services, so it can't be recovered by some business, it can't become part of their total revenue and part of their profits. So that's a customer killer. Republicans say, no, 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 we don't have a revenue problem, what we have is a spending problem, by which they mean we should be cutting government spending. But again, one person's spending is another person's income. So to cut spending is to cut someone's income. And income leads to sales, and sales lead to jobs. So this, again, is pushing things in the wrong direction, both sides. How do we get there? What's behind this sort of thinking? It's the idea that the government is constrained in the same way that a household is constrained. Let me say, without getting into the whole thing with the euro, that things are different for countries that use the euro as their currency. You don't have the same fiscal space, policy space that countries like the US have. And I think you probably all in this room have recognized that at this point. So the idea that in order to behave responsibly, the government has to behave like a household, not spend everything it takes in, pay down debt and save more. Okay? We generally in America, people think that. The idea that the government can only spend more money if it can get it from people who have money. And there's only so much money out there available to be loaned out, and if government wants to borrow more to finance a deficit, then there's less money for someone else to borrow. And that leads to higher interest rates and crowding out of other presumably more efficient kinds of spending, right, by the private sector. We think there's some sort of a fine line. Remember the Reinhardt-Rogoff tipping point, 90% debt to GDP ratio. It's okay to have a debt to GDP ratio of 75, maybe even 80, maybe even 85%, but man, once you hit 90%, that's the tipping point. And if you grow the debt beyond that level, then the economy begins to slow and negative sorts of things happen. So there's a fine line between a government that can service its debt and a government that begins to turn insolvent, where interest rates spike, you're rolling over debt, borrowing at higher and higher rates, and the next thing you know, you're Greece. Okay, this is a story that was told in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, all over the TV, and Americans hear this all the time. And we're told that we have to have our government cut and tighten, and we have to have this austerity because otherwise we were going to be like Greece. Okay? Now, as I said, those are zombie ideas. They're very hard to kill. You ever try to kill a zombie? Can't be done. It's impossible. They just keep coming back, right? So most people don't even try to question this narrative. But there's a new guy in town, and I want you to hear what he said recently.
First of all, you don't have to think about it. So we have the money. We need to go crazy. This is the United States government. First of all, you don't have to talk to me for the money. Okay, so the never.
Okay, so this is candidate, now President-elect Donald Trump, saying, I hate to tell you, there's never going to be a default on U.S. Treasuries. I hate to tell you, because this is the United States government. I hate to tell you, but we print the money. Okay, we're never going to end up in default in a position where we can't pay our creditors because we can't find the dollars. He's saying, of course you can always create the dollars. You print the money. Okay, now that rattled people. People said, oh my God, he's crazy. You know, he's unfit. He's a lunatic. We can't possibly elect this person. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And so Bloomberg ran this clip on their television show. And I wrote to my friend who works at Bloomberg, hosts a TV show, and I said, why don't you show this clip alongside that one? And so he did.
Are U.S. Treasury bonds still safe to invest in?
Very much so. I think this is not an issue of credit rating. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default. What about?
Zero probability of default. The U.S. government can pay any debt it has because it can always print money. It's the same exact statement, only it's coming from the oracle, right? It's coming from the maestro. And nobody called him crazy when he said it. Nobody said he didn't know what he was talking about as chairman of the Federal Reserve who knows where the money comes from. But with Trump, people said, oh, this is crazy, right? But it's not crazy. Of course, everybody recognizes this.
We're very special ones, there's no question about it. And we will pay our debts in the end. So it is not like if we don't pay we can't pay. We've got the right to turn our own money. That's the key. Greece wants to talk about their money. They have their problems. They would not. They have other problems, but they would not have that problem. And 17 countries in Europe gave up the right to print their own money. That's enormously important. And we've got the right to turn our own money. So our credit's good.
Our credit's good. Warren Buffett, billionaire investor, right? Our credit is good. We're not like then, this is an older tape, but he says 17 countries that gave up the right to print their currency. We're never going to be like Greece, he says, because Greece gave up the right to create drachma. And he said if they still had the drachma, they'd have other problems, but they wouldn't have a debt problem. Okay, so this is not something that nobody recognizes. It's just kind of something that no one says in polite company. But at the end of the day, people realize that having control of your currency really does mean that obligations that are denominated in your currency to make payments in a currency that you and only you can create are default risk-free. And that matters a great deal, it turns out. So one last quote. This comes from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. This is from research that came out of the St. Louis Fed. As the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. can never become insolvent. That is, unable to pay its bills. It is never going to be shut out of credit markets. It can't go broke, and so forth and so on. The words that matter there are sole manufacturer. Everyone in this room knows that the word we use in everyday language to describe a sole manufacturer of something is a monopolist. And what the United States has is a monopoly over the creation of the US dollar. It has given itself the exclusive right to create the US dollar. No one else in the world can legally create our currency. Only we can. So if the question is, can we afford to pay seniors, future retirees, their dependents, the disabled? Can we sustain Medicare? Can we pay for roads and bridges and other things? Or do we have to find the money somewhere and get money from rich people or people who have money or something in order to pay for things? The answer is clearly no. That isn't the way things work. But it is a deeply entrenched belief that governments, like the rest of us, have to go out and earn or get money in order to be able to spend. And the truth is Trump took a beating during the campaign period. And people say, well, he's a terrible businessman. You know, he just, everything he touched, he bankrupt companies and, you know, the steaks and the vodka and I don't know what all else. But he just drives these enterprises into the ground. Don't give him the keys to the White House. My God, he'll bankrupt the nation. So even Donald Trump cannot bankrupt the United States of America. We cannot go broke. Okay? There is absolutely no way in which we are going to run out of dollars. That simply can't happen. Here's the big statement. We actually need the government to run budget deficits almost all the time. Almost all the time. Now, people hear that and they say, oh my God, she's fiscally irresponsible. That cannot possibly be an intelligent statement. Okay, let me try to defend that statement because it is true that a lot of people disagree with it. We have members of Congress that consider themselves fiscal deficit hawks. Man, these guys are hardcore. They would amend the US Constitution to make sure that the federal government never spends a dime more than it collects in taxes. Balanced budgets, always. Every calendar year, every fiscal year, every lunar year, I don't care. I want the budget in balance all the time. Hardcore. And then we have the sort of apologetic deficit bird, the deficit doves. The deficit doves say, well, I don't want to go that far because sometimes the economy gets very weak. And when the economy gets weak and you go into a crisis like we had recently, it's important that the government is able, has the permission to run a deficit because that helps bring about a recovery. But when the economy recovers, that's when we want the budget to move into surplus. So deficits during the weak period, surpluses during the recovery, and the budget is balanced over the course of the business cycle. That's what we want. My question is, could Trump see through both of their flaws. Might Donald Trump turn out to be a deficit owl? The owl is just a bird that I chose because owls are supposed to be wise, and they can see in the dark and see things the others are missing and so forth. So let's go with deficit owl. A deficit owl does not look at the budget outcome and draw any conclusion whatsoever about whether this is a good budget outcome or a bad budget outcome. Maybe the budget is in surplus, 10 billion. You don't celebrate that. You have no idea whether that's a good number or a bad number. Maybe the budget is in deficit, 100 billion. You don't decry that because you have no idea whether that's a bad number or a good number. What a deficit owl does is focus on balancing the broader economy, not the government's budget, fiscal budget. So macroeconomic outcomes trump everything, okay? So this is a graph that I use probably in every public talk that I give, and I use it because it's super effective. And people tell me all the time that once they see this, they never unsee it. They can never think about the deficit in the same way again. So I want to show you what happened. This is actual data. I didn't make this up. It's not hypothetical. This is data for the US. It breaks the US economy up into 3 pieces. One piece is the private sector, everything in blue. Another piece is the government, everything in red. And the last piece is everything else, the rest of the world. And that's what's in green here. That's the whole of it. I didn't leave anything out. Everything is accounted for and there can't be anything missing. It all adds to 0, which is why it's a mirror image. It collapses on itself. And what this shows is the relationship between these 3 sectors, foreign, government, and private, and how financial assets move between the sectors, okay, when payment flows, outflows are made. So I want you to notice a couple things. When we're below the 0 there, that sector is running a deficit. It is spending more than it takes in. When you're above 0, that sector is in surplus, collecting more than it is spending. What do you notice first about government? Red. Almost always in deficit. Almost always in deficit. What do you notice about the private sector? Blue. Almost always in surplus. Okay? So if I'm playing the role of the government and I'm running a budget deficit, it means I'm spending 100 billion into the economy and I'm taxing 90 billion out. Yeah? So I've run a deficit of 10 billion. I put 100 in, I took out 90. I ran a deficit. What else happened? Somebody got 10. There is 10 residing somewhere in the non-government part of the economy. And guess what they call it? They call it a surplus, which means if I reduce or eliminate my deficit, I am definitionally reducing or eliminating someone else's surplus. It can't work any other way. You know why? Because balance sheets have to balance. And this is an internally consistent accounting framework. Okay, that's all this is. So look what happened there. When Bill Clinton, President Clinton, ran his budget surpluses. In the US, this was very much celebrated at the time. All of a sudden, the government had gone from all this red ink, all these budget deficits, and after decades of deficit spending, the federal government's budget finally moved into surplus. And you see that little bit of red poking up there. Those are the Clinton surpluses. And everybody said, you know, hallelujah, this is wonderful, we did it. We're the most fiscally responsible party because we balanced the budget and delivered a surplus. But look what happened. So I'm government, right? I'm in surplus. Now I'm collecting 100 billion in taxes, but I'm only spending 90 billion back into the economy. That leaves me with an extra 10. I'm in surplus. But where are you folks? If you're the non-government part of the economy, you're down 10. You're in deficit. And because I was doing that as government, taking out more than I put back in, and the rest of the world, the green up there, the rest of the world was also running trade surpluses, that's what those are, They were taking more dollars out of the US economy than they were putting back in. You add my surplus, government, to the trade surplus run by the rest of the world, add our two surpluses, and what do you get? The private sector deficit. And look what happened to the poor private sector. It went from surplus into deficit on an unprecedented scale, totally unprecedented and unsustainable. There is no way that the US private sector could go on year after year after year spending more than its income, leveraging up, because that's how you spend more than your income, you borrow. So this is private sector debt fueling an economic boom. And on the surface, it looked like a great economy. We had high growth rates, high productivity growth, low inflation, and very low unemployment. And people called it the Goldilocks economy. Bill Clinton is a genius. Look what he gave us. Except that it was all built on this very fragile foundation, which was private sector indebtedness. And when it ended, boy did it end, we got the financial crisis, right? So here's Donald Trump. And my question is, does he get this? Donald Trump seems to sort of get this. And he's quoted not long ago as saying, it's called priming the pump. Sometimes you have to do that a little bit to get things going. We have no choice, otherwise we die on the vine. The economy would be crushed under Hillary. But no matter who it is, if she gets elected or if I get elected, the debt is going up. That's a really candid thing for a presidential candidate to have said. So what does Donald Trump want to do? We're getting near the end here. Donald Trump has not given a whole lot of detail about a huge economic program, but we know that it includes a couple of big things, a few big things. One, sweeping tax cuts, across-the-board tax cuts, but most of the benefits go to those at the very top. So he's looking to reduce the marginal income tax rate on the highest income earners, cut that to 33%. He wants to reduce corporate taxes, ideally to the Irish level, but if he can't get all the way to 15%, he's willing, he says, to settle for 20%. He'd like to get them to where the UK is. Make the US, as he says, more competitive. Cut the estate tax, the inheritance tax on wealth passed down from generation to generation. This is how dynasties are built. He wants to completely eliminate the estate tax, so cut that to zero. This would amount to more than 14% tax cut for those in the top 0.1%. That should say 0.1, not 0.01. The poorest 20%, the bottom fifth, would get an average tax cut of less than 1%. He wants to spend $1 trillion improving roads, bridges, rail, wastewater facilities, the whole of our public infrastructure, and he wants to spread that out over 10 years, and he wants to beef up military and defense spending. So what does that mean? It means he's moving the numbers in the right direction. He's not doing what I said before, the customer killer things, which are tax increases and spending cuts, both of which take income away from people. He's flipping both. We're going to cut taxes and increase spending. This is not someone whose objective is to achieve a balanced budget. This is someone whose objectives are different, right? He wants to enact tax cuts primarily for those at the very top. He wants to build things. He's a builder after all, so he wants to do infrastructure, and he wants to strengthen the military, as he puts it. So what would be the net effect? If we got Donald Trump, if all of this stuff passed somehow miraculously, even though the House and Senate are both controlled by Republicans in the US, I don't anticipate this stuff sailing through, because you heard Paul Ryan and other members of Congress, and they really are deficit hawks, and they really do worry about the debt. And they're going to be reluctant to just rubber stamp Donald Trump's spending increases. The tax cuts they'll go for, but the spending increases are going to be a lot tougher. So the expectation is that Trump would increase the deficit to about 5.5% of GDP and add another 25% or so to the national debt. We're right at the end here. Janet Yellen. just yesterday in remarks where she's giving advice to Donald Trump. Now think about this. Yellen's job, the Fed's job, is supposed to be to deliver high employment, full employment, and price stability. That's the dual mandate. Now you got this guy coming along and saying, we're going to use the fiscal policy paddle, and we're going to try to really kickstart economic growth. You might think that Janet Yellen would welcome the help and say, whew, thank goodness, because it's not a panacea, it's not the ideal tool, we can't do it alone, we could use a little help from the fiscal side. But instead, she's throwing up a caution flag. And her advice to Donald Trump reads, in part, this is a quote, "The economy is already operating relatively close to full employment." What is she trying to say? Don't push this economy too far. We're already very close to full employment. If you push too far, we're going to end up with an inflation problem. So she's concerned. She's raising concerns. And she says, don't forget about the deficit, right? She's waving her finger. Don't forget about the deficit. With the debt to GDP ratio currently around 77%, there's not much fiscal space left. Now, this is just not so. Okay, I think that this is a little bit political here at this point. She does encourage him, if he's going to go forward with higher spending in parts of the economy, she says you should choose policies that would improve long-run growth and productivity. And that, of course, has to be a reasonable thing to say. So what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. I think that if the fiscal outlook improves, if it looks like Donald Trump is going to be successful in getting the House and Senate to pass a budget that includes lots of additional spending on infrastructure, even military, if you get the tax cuts through, then it's possible that growth really does shoot up, maybe even a couple of percentage points. That's possible. If growth accelerates faster than the Fed currently anticipates, that's simply going to justify the Fed doing what? Tightening more aggressively. So rates are going to go up faster. And what might that do? It might strengthen the dollar, and it might cause the trade deficit to balloon even more. It might cause problems in financial markets because there's leverage, and as interest rates go up, some people will be caught out. You could end up triggering a financial crisis or at least an event of some kind. So we don't know, but it will be interesting to watch and see. So thank you very much. I think I stopped right on time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kelton, and please stay with us on the stage for the next few minutes. Pogovor v nadaljevanju bo s cenjeno gostjo namreč vodil gospod Peter Frankl, ki se nam že pridružuje. Tudi vi, spoštovane in spoštovani, pa ste vabljeni, da se pogovoru pridružite s svojimi vprašanji, svojimi mislimi in izkušnjami. Po tem pogovoru bomo nadaljevali brez odmora in prisrčno pozdravili tudi predsednika vlade Republike Slovenije. Pogovor z njim bo vodil profesor dr. Mojmir Mrak z Ekonomske fakultete v Ljubljani. Zdaj pa izvolite, gospod Peter Frankl.
Hvala lepa. Yeah, this was very interesting. You know, how do you find the word Trumponomics? Is there such a thing? Will there be such a thing? Could you outline some of it?
Yeah, sure. That's exactly what I just did. And although I wrote that word on the airplane, I didn't actually say it once I got here. So
yeah, but you said you didn't actually. I mean, it's not so easy to.
Yeah, but how people are using the term Trumponomics right now is tax cuts and increased spending. And from a Republican to couple the two, that's rather unusual. So you're getting this term Trumponomics to describe the 1-2 punch, right, for the fiscal policy, that both sides are designed to have a stimulatory effect.
Sorry, if we move a bit away from the economy itself, but we'll get back to it sooner or later. Now, tariffs, protectionism, what can Europe expect? What is your view?
Oh, you're not going to get any of that stuff.
Oh, just like that.
So Donald Trump is a salesman, okay? I guess all politicians are to some extent, but Donald Trump is a salesman. And 45% tariffs, which is what he was talking about when he was campaigning for president, are never, ever going to happen. Why? Because his own party loathes the idea, and they control both houses. They're free traders, and they do not want a trade war. They do not want tariffs. They'll look for other ways to make the argument that they're doing more to protect American jobs, to lure countries to the states and so forth, but you're not going to get tariffs. That's my guess.
So it was just, they were just selling an idea that was never to be realized anyway.
On so many levels, not just on trade, but on, he's committed to protecting Social Security. And the very first things we've done is watch him surround himself by people who have long championed cuts to Social Security, minimum wage increases. I doubt we're going to see anything there. But yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. That
what I see from your presentation, I'm not saying that you're a Trump fan. I'm not. But it seems to me that, you are not really praising him, but he seems to be okay. I mean, sorry, this is what I get from your presentation.
I was an ambassadorial scholar when I was in college, so I think I'm channeling my ambassadorial diplomatic side. I'm looking for, we all are, okay, especially economists in the US, we are all asking ourselves, is there a silver lining? Is there a silver lining? Democrats have been trying for a long period of time to get infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that we both desperately need and that we understand can create millions of good-paying jobs. So Democrats want infrastructure. Donald Trump says he's going to build massive infrastructure. So we're asking ourselves, because we'd like to have infrastructure, could that be something that we could support? He talked about increasing the minimum wage. Could we come to an agreement where we get minimum wage increase? I mean, so I'm looking for silver lining in some of the things that he's proposed that align very closely. For example, I was the chief economist to Senator Bernie Sanders. So there are places where Bernie was asking for and fighting for some of the same things.
Does this mean that Bernie is actually closer to Trump than he would have been to Hillary?
No.
No.
Would you like me to elaborate? No, I don't think so. In fact, the point I'm trying to make without really overtly making it is that the man is a salesman, and I think Bernie understands that there is a better than 50-50 chance that he's not actually interested, Trump, in pushing for a large number of the things that he told working class people that he was going to do to improve their lives.
So definitely there's going to be political change, but in a way, does it mean, business as usual? What is
in some ways, that might be the best we can hope for, is business as usual.
Okay, and what is the worst case scenario?
Well, the worst case scenario is that you start deporting 11 million people.
Of course. But
yeah.
But of course, I understand that. But let's say, what is the realistic worst case scenario? Because you have said that this is
the realistic worst case scenario is that Donald Trump decides he doesn't really want to be the executive. He doesn't really want to be, as Bush called himself, the decider. That he's happy to continue to go out and meet big crowds of adoring fans, but he's going to turn over the keys to the decision making to his vice president. And there we know what kinds of policies, and I think that Mike Pence could probably work very successfully with the Republican Congress on doing the sorts of things that will not help working people, but in fact do exactly the opposite, put greater strains on their lives by privatizing Social Security, dismantling Obamacare, taking health care away from millions of people who will then have nothing. So I could go on and on and on. So you think that, anxiety, economic anxiety, got people to vote for Donald Trump, and they could end up in far worse economic shape as a consequence.
I really find this so amazing. I mean, what you're actually delivering, I mean, you're delivering me the message that in some way, in some peculiar way, Donald Trump is a pillar of stability if we compare him to Pence.
Well, I suppose I don't mean to present him that way. What I'm saying is that I think there is a chance that Donald Trump understands the anxiety, the very real economic anxiety that exists in many places across the country. Working people are falling further and further behind and that they're hurting. And he promised them, and his words were, help is on the way. Help is on the way. Now look, if Donald Trump wants to turn out and have 20,000 people show up and adore him in a football stadium again, he's got to do something that really improves things for them. They're not going to just keep coming out and filling stadiums. He's got to actually follow through with some concrete measures that lift people's wages, that create more opportunity. And if he doesn't do that, he's going to lose all the adoring fans. And I think that's what he feeds on. So if he stays active, because I think he does have a fairly short attention span, if he stays active and he fights for some of the policies that he promised to make good on and people's lives improve, then he feels good, they feel good. But if he checks out and turns over the keys to Pence, all bets are off.
About the attention span of Donald Trump, you have to know that he's only a man.
He's an extremely hardworking guy, right? I mean, the stories that I hear are that he sleeps 3 or 4 hours a night, and that's it. He is up very late. We all know this because we all follow him on Twitter, so we know he's tweeting at 2 a.m., and then he's tweeting again by 5:30 in the morning. So I don't think he sleeps a whole lot. I think he's got lots of energy. I just don't know how he's going to channel it.
You know, you have brought up the inflation. Where has the secular stagnation gone?
Well, when you say where has the secular stagnation gone, secular stagnation, remember, is that term that Alvin Hansen, an economist who was active many, many years ago, invented and Larry Summers sort of revived. And secular stagnation is just this idea that we're stuck in a bad place. We're stuck in a bad place where we have slow growth and low inflation, and we just can't get the two to tick up.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
it hasn't gone anywhere. It's very much a global phenomenon.
Sure, I understand that, but it seems that this inflation threat is going through a revival process. And it was so modern 2 years ago to talk about the secular stagnation, and there will be no inflation anyway because we have this phenomenon.
Yeah, so, well, everybody's hoping that that's not the case. I think what people are increasingly willing to recognize is that it is just not that easy to generate inflation. In the textbooks, you open your money and banking or your macroeconomics textbook up to the chapter on monetary policy, and somewhere in there is an equation, and it says if you want to increase inflation, you just increase the rate of growth of the money supply. It's that easy. But it's not that easy to start up an inflationary cycle, and that's why I think Janet Yellen probably deep down inside is hoping that Trump does do something kind of ambitious to get wages up and then get prices up.
Will Janet Yellen remain to be the Fed governor?
She has indicated that she will not voluntarily step down before her term ends.
Okay,
so she intends to finish it out. Beyond that, I strongly suspect, just based on his personality, that he's going to want to appoint his own Fed chair.
I see. And would this be a step in the other direction? What would it mean?
Impossible to know. You know why? Because Donald Trump has at times criticized Yellen for keeping interest rates too low, and he claimed she was doing it in order to help Hillary Clinton. And on the other hand, once he wants to do all this borrowing and spending, he's going to presumably want interest rates to stay low. So I don't know whether he'll choose someone who will raise rates because he thinks Yellen has kept them too low, or whether he'll choose someone who will keep rates low because it will help him.
I have some more time, right? Okay. 5 minutes. Draga občinstvo, če je kako vprašanje, kak komentar, prosim vas, da ste zelo učinkoviti. 5 minut še imamo brez traktatov. Izvolite, gospod Sibinčič.
Hvala. Apparently, Donald Trump got a strong support from the Rust Belt and West Virginia unemployed people.
Yeah.
And he promised them jobs back. Now it's quite clear that the process of them losing jobs, they went whatever to Mexico and so on, is irreversible. These people are never going to work for $2 or $3, whatever an hour, and they will never, like 20 million people will never be retrained to whatever jobs with higher value added. What do you think will happen in 2 or 3 years down the line when these people realize that Donald Trump's promises were just as empty as the Republicans that they were so heavily criticized before?
That's a great question, and we touched on that a little bit. What will happen if he doesn't deliver for the people who put him in office? And as you say, this was largely people in the Rust Belt, and people who lost jobs in manufacturing industries in particular due to trade. What will happen 2 to 3 years from now if things haven't improved for those people? I think the answer has to be kind of obvious in that he is not going to get another 4 years if people collectively decide this guy sold us a bill of goods and he didn't deliver on it. Now look, jobs actually are coming back to the U.S. There are even companies that moved operations to China a decade, 2 decades ago, and now have found it feasible, was largely due to the fact that energy prices had come down so much. But some of those companies actually returned and started producing in the U.S. What if he got corporate tax rates down to 15%? What if he got them to 0? I mean, these guys would love to see a corporate, I don't know. I think that you might see a number of companies move back to the U.S. and start producing here again. I think, though, for me, the idea that we're going to bring back manufacturing jobs doesn't make a lot of sense. We used to be an agricultural country. That's what we did. And we had a small manufacturing sector. And then over time, agriculture shrunk to something like 2 or 3% of the economy. We became a manufacturing country. And then over time, manufacturing shrunk, and now services are 80% of everything we do. And I think the trend is likely to continue so that eventually 90+% of everything we produce is in the service sector. I don't think those jobs are coming back. The question is, can they be good paying jobs with good benefits and be service sector jobs? That's the real, I think, challenge for somebody.
Okay. Činstvo, audience, do I see a hand? Saj veste, kratko, jedrnato.
Hvala. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Alexander. I'm from IMB program. Basically, my question relates more to taxation and the corporate tax to 15% from 35%. We've seen some deals, M&A activity, AstraZeneca taken over, probably could have been taken over by Pfizer, and then shifted their headquarters abroad to UK because it's a lower tax rate. Burger King and Tim Horton to Canada. So that tax shift, what would be the impact if? So, like you said, some jobs from some actually companies would come back, but to what magnitude? Also, as a follow-up question with Congress, it has been a real struggle to deal with the fiscal cliff at the end of the year for the next government expenditure, whatever. So what is actually the main constraint here? Because usually it's Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell trying to fight out something and come to an agreement, and there's no other members of Congress participating here. And why is there not more collaborative work with the president as well? So those would be my questions. Thank you.
Well, the last time we had collaboration on the fiscal cliff deal, we ended up with the sequester. And that was bad. That was a bad deal. So I'd prefer that they not collaborate if what they do when they get together is give us atrocious policy like the sequester, which both parties hate, by the way. The sequester is this across-the-board spending cuts that get triggered every year for 10 years. And anyway, now you've got Republicans in control of both houses, right? So Paul Ryan has already indicated that the government will be funded through March. So that gets Trump in, that gets the new Congress in, everything is controlled by Republicans. I don't think they're going to have any trouble whatsoever raising the debt ceiling when that comes about. Again, on your trade question, I don't know that anybody has looked. I bet Dean Baker and some people at EPI have looked at the question the way you posed it, which is what would happen if corporate tax rates were cut from X to Y, how much additional job creation and that sort of thing. I'm not a trade economist. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that current account surpluses in countries that have them, largely due to the fact that they've got these massive multinationals, Ireland and so forth. If they were to shift back to the US, Canada, you're going to see some pain on their end, obviously.
My impression is, Stephanie, that you're an optimist at the moment.
I think this is an extremely dark time for our country. Not optimistic. Look, I'm visiting here, so I'm trying to be, pleasant. Honestly, it's not an exaggeration to say that we're scared. Americans are scared. And in spite of, the election outcome, most Americans are very deeply troubled by what the next 2 and 4 years is going to look like in our country. So I try to focus on the economic side because that's where my area of expertise is, but on the social and cultural side of this, it's extremely worrying. I don't know what our country's going to look like by the time my son gets into high school.
But after every darkness, there's light.
Yes. See, you're an optimist.
I am. I have to be. Dear Stephanie, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Hvala lepa. Prosim da... Hvala. Prosim, da ne zapuščate dvorane zdaj. Prosim, da ne zapuščate dvorane zdaj, ker prihaja predsednik vlade. We have to welcome the Prime Minister now. We have to move from the stage.
I don't know. Is that okay? Let me get this off.